A wealthy man mocks a homeless stranger, confident in his superiority until a shocking twist reveals the truth. What happens next will leave you speechless. Witness a powerful story of resilience, redemption, and the life-changing lesson of never judging a book by its cover. The late afternoon sun bathed the bustling city street in a golden hue, but the vibrant energy did little to soften the stark reality of the lives that intersected there. Amidst the cacophony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and vendors shouting to attract customers, a man sat quietly on a worn blanket near the corner of the park. His name was Henry Wallace, a figure many passersby had come to recognize but seldom acknowledged. Henry's appearance was unassuming, a weathered face framed by unkempt gray hair and a beard that had grown uneven over time. His clothes, though clean, were frayed at the edges, a faded navy jacket and patched khaki trousers that spoke of years of wear. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were sharp and observant, hinting at a life once filled with purpose and achievement, now veiled by the unfortunate circumstances of homelessness. A small, hand-painted sign rested beside him, "Anything helps." God bless. Despite his circumstances, Henry sat with an air of quiet dignity, his posture straight and his movements deliberate. He did not shout or beg. Instead, he offered a polite thank you to anyone who dropped coins into the tin can at his feet. Across the street, Edward Hastings, a wealthy investment banker in his late 40s, emerged from a luxury black sedan. Edward was the epitome of entitlement, his tailored charcoal suit and polished leather shoes reflecting his privileged life. With a phone pressed to his ear, he barked instructions to someone on the other end, his tone impatient and dismissive. Edward prided himself on being a man of stature, someone who had earned his place in the world. To him, appearances mattered above all else, and those who didn't meet his standards of success were either lazy or undeserving. As he ended the call and crossed the street, his sharp green eyes scanned the crowd with a mixture of superiority and disdain. That's when he spotted Henry. Henry, oblivious to Edward's approach, smiled faintly as a young woman dropped $1 into his can. "Thank you, miss." "Have a blessed day," he said warmly. Edward stopped abruptly a few feet away, his expression darkening. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. He made no effort to hide his disgust as he walked closer. "Hey, you," Edward called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Henry looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Yes, sir," Edward gestured at the blanket and tin can. "You think sitting here begging for scraps is a life? People like you are the reason this city is going downhill. Filth like this shouldn't be allowed in public spaces." Henry blinked, his composure unshaken. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir. I'm just trying to get by like everyone else," Edward scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Get by? You call this getting by? You're nothing but a burden to society. If you had any self-respect, you'd find a job instead of leeching off decent people." A small crowd had begun to form, their curious gazes shifting between the two men. Some frowned at Edward's harsh words, while others whispered among themselves, uncertain of whether to intervene. Henry stood slowly, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. He met Edward's glare with steady eyes. "I don't want any trouble, sir. I'm just trying to make it through the day." Edward stepped closer, his face inches from Henry's. "You don't deserve to make it through the day," he spat. The words hung in the air like a weight, but before anyone could react, Edward leaned forward and spat directly in Henry's face. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the act of dehumanizing disrespect silencing even the murmurs of onlookers. Henry froze, his eyes closing briefly as he wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. When he opened them again, there was no anger, only a quiet resolve. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir," he said softly. The onlookers shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others staring at Edward with disbelief and disgust. A young man in a hoodie stepped forward. "Hey man, that's not cool," he said, his voice raised. Edward turned to the young man, his expression haughty. "Mind your business," he snapped. As the tension hung thick in the air, Henry bent down to pick up his tin can. His movements were unhurried, his posture steady. "Thank you all for your time," he said to the crowd, offering a faint smile before turning to Edward. "And thank you, sir, for showing me who you are." Edward frowned, momentarily thrown off by Henry's composed response. But his arrogance quickly returned. "Yeah, well, maybe you'll think twice before polluting the streets with your presence," he said coldly. Without another word, Henry walked away, heading toward a bench beneath a large oak tree. The crowd slowly dispersed, though a few stayed behind, exchanging disapproving glances in Edward's direction. As Henry settled on the bench, an older woman approached him, her face filled with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Henry nodded. "I've been through worse," he said, his tone calm but firm. The woman hesitated, then reached out to place a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than most people I know," she said softly before walking away. From a distance, Edward watched the interaction, still fuming but slightly unsettled. He shook his head, muttering to himself as he adjusted his cufflinks and strode back toward his car. Little did Edward know, this encounter was only the beginning, and the man he had dismissed so easily was about to show him just how wrong he had been. The bustling street carried on as usual, a symphony of footsteps, chatter, and distant car horns. Yet near the park's edge, a confrontation had captured the attention of those nearby. Edward Hastings stood tall, his polished shoes gleaming in the sunlight as he loomed over Henry Wallace, the homeless man he had singled out. Edward's voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the hum of the city. "I can't believe people like you are allowed to sit here." Sullying the streets, Edward spat, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you even try to better yourself, or is this your idea of a career?" Henry remained seated on the worn blanket beneath him, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His weathered face was calm, almost serene, as if Edward's words were little more than a passing breeze. He straightened slightly, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "I'm just here trying to get by," Sir Henry said quietly, his voice steady and respectful. Edward sneered, his temper flaring. "Trying to get by? Spare me the sob story," he scoffed, his words loud enough to draw attention from passers-by. "You probably made every bad decision possible to end up like this. Let me guess, drugs, laziness, or just plain incompetence." Several people walking by slowed their pace, their curious glances betraying a mix of unease and disapproval. A mother with a stroller whispered something to her companion, while a middle-aged man stopped a few feet away, his brow furrowing as he listened. Henry inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, his hands tightening slightly on his knees. "I've had my share of challenges, that's true," he said softly, meeting Edward's glare. "But I don't think you know enough about me to make those assumptions." This simple statement only fueled Edward's ire. "Assumptions? Please. It's not rocket science. Look at you sitting here with your little sign and tin can. You're everything that's wrong with this city." He waved his hand dismissively, as if Henry were an inconvenience he could swat away. Despite the growing crowd and Edward's increasingly venomous tone, Henry's composure remained unshaken. He shifted slightly, his posture straightening as he folded his hands in front of him. His calm, almost dignified demeanor created a stark contrast to Edward's arrogance. "Everyone's journey is different," Henry said, his voice level but firm. "I don't think it's fair to judge someone based on where they are today. You might be surprised by where they've been." Edward's laugh was cold and sharp. "Oh, don't give me that philosophical nonsense. You're not some misunderstood genius. You're just another leech draining resources from people who actually work for a living." By now, a small group of onlookers had gathered, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions. A young woman with a backpack stood to the side, her arms crossed as she glared at Edward. Nearby, an elderly man leaned on his cane, shaking his head slowly. "That's enough," someone muttered, their voice barely audible over Edward's tirade. Henry, aware of the crowd but unbothered by their presence, offered a faint smile to a child who peeked curiously from behind their parent. His actions seemed almost deliberate, as if to remind everyone watching that dignity could not be stolen, even in the face of such disrespect. A man in a hoodie stepped closer, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Hey man," he called out to Edward. "Why don't you just leave him alone? He's not bothering you." Edward turned sharply, his green eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? This has nothing to do with you." "It does when you're shouting like a jerk in the middle of the street," the man replied, his voice steady but laced with irritation. Edward scoffed and turned back to Henry. "Look at this defending the beggar. I suppose birds of a feather flock together." Henry finally rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. Despite his worn clothes and the strain in his shoulders, he seemed to stand taller than Edward in that moment. "I appreciate the concern," he said, addressing the man in the hoodie, "but I'm fine." Turning back to Edward, Henry locked eyes with him, his expression calm but piercing. "You have a lot of anger, sir. I hope whatever's troubling you finds its way to peace." The simplicity of his words caused a brief flicker of something in Edward's face, hesitation, perhaps, or confusion. But the moment passed quickly, and Edward's sneer returned. "Peace? Don't lecture me about peace," Edward snapped. "You're the one disturbing it by being here." As Edward continued his tirade, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "What's his problem?" a woman whispered to her friend. Another man shook his head and muttered, "Can't believe someone would talk to another human being like that." The crowd's disapproval became harder to ignore, though Edward appeared too blinded by his own arrogance to notice. Henry, however, remained as still and calm as ever. His silence spoke louder than Edward's words, a quiet strength that left the onlookers with a sense of admiration. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is that man being so mean?" The mother knelt down and replied softly, "Because some people don't know how to treat others with respect. But see how calm that man is. That's real strength." Edward's voice rose again, his insults now bordering on incoherence. "You're pathetic, you know that? Sitting here like this. I don't even know why I'm wasting my time on you." Henry looked at him steadily, his expression unchanging. "Maybe you'll figure that out one day," he said quietly. Edward scoffed and turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath as he strode away. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though a few people lingered, their gazes following Edward's retreating figure with visible disapproval. The street seemed to settle back into its rhythm, though the air around Henry Wallace felt heavier after the confrontation. Passers-by who had witnessed Edward Hastings' tirade continued to cast occasional glances his way, their expressions ranging from pity to quiet admiration. Henry, however, carried on as if nothing had happened, rearranging the few belongings on his blanket with meticulous care. A man in his late 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, approached Henry with a curious look. "Hey," he said cautiously, "you handled that guy back there like a pro. I don't know how you stayed so calm." Henry smiled faintly, his hands resting on his knees. "Anger's a luxury I can't afford," he replied. His tone was measured and deliberate, the kind of voice that commanded attention without raising its volume. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," the younger man said, still lingering. Did you do something else?" before he hesitated, not wanting to offend. Henry's smile widened slightly, and he gave a small nod. "Life has a way of changing course, my friend," he said cryptically. "What we do now doesn't always reflect what we've done before." The younger man seemed intrigued but didn't press further. He nodded respectfully and handed Henry a small bill before walking away. Henry's calm, articulate manner continued to draw quiet attention from those around him. A woman pushing a stroller stopped briefly to offer him a granola bar, which he accepted with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. May your kindness come back to you tenfold," he said with a sincerity that made her pause. "You speak like a teacher," she remarked, smiling. Henry chuckled softly. "Perhaps I've taught a lesson or two in my time," he replied, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. A few minutes later, an older man wearing a vendor's apron emerged from a nearby food cart. "Henry," he called, his voice warm and familiar. Henry turned, his smile deepening. "Miguel, my friend. How's business today?" "Same as always," Miguel replied, walking closer. He handed Henry a paper cup filled with steaming coffee. "This one's on me." Henry accepted it graciously. "You spoil me, Miguel." Miguel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. I still can't believe you're here, man. After everything you used to do." Henry raised a hand gently, cutting him off. "Life changes, Miguel. We adapt." Miguel shook his head, clearly unwilling to argue but unable to hide the respect in his gaze. "You're a better man than most," he said before returning to his cart. As the day went on, Henry continued to demonstrate a quiet generosity that seemed almost incongruous with his circumstances. A young girl approached hesitantly, clutching a broken toy in her hands. "Mister, can you fix this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry took the toy gently, examining it with the focus of someone used to solving problems. "I think I can manage that," he said, producing a small toolkit from his bag. Within minutes, the toy was as good as new. "Thank you," the girl exclaimed, running back to her mother, who offered Henry a grateful smile. From across the street, Edward Hastings stood by his car, watching the interaction with a sour expression. He shook his head, muttering to himself. "Theatrics," he scoffed. "All for show." Edward's driver, a stoic man in his 50s, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Sir, are you ready to leave?" "Not yet," Edward replied, his gaze fixed on Henry. Despite his outward contempt, there was a flicker of something in his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. Edward crossed the street again, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The bystanders who had previously witnessed his outburst watched warily, unsure of his intentions. "Still playing the saint, I see," Edward said, standing over Henry once more. "Helping little kids and charming the locals. Must be nice to have so much time on your hands." Henry looked up at him, unperturbed. Helping others doesn't take much time, sir. Just a little effort. Edward laughed bitterly. Spoken like someone who's never had real responsibilities. You wouldn't last a day in my shoes. Henry tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. And you wouldn't last a day in mine. The simple statement seemed to strike a nerve. Edward's jaw tightened and he leaned closer. You think you're clever, don't you? Henry didn't flinch. I think we all have something to learn, no matter where we stand, he said. Edward straightened, his face twisting into a sneer. You talk like you're someone important. But look at you sitting here, relying on handouts. You're nothing. Despite Edward's continued arrogance, the onlookers began to see Henry in a new light. His measured responses and quiet dignity contrasted sharply with Edward's bluster, creating a palpable shift in the crowd's perception. A young woman approached Henry cautiously, holding a notebook. Excuse me, she said, her voice nervous. This might sound strange, but you remind me of someone. Are you? Henry smiled gently and shook his head. I'm just a man trying to make it through the day, he said. Her curiosity lingered, but she didn't press further. She walked away, glancing back over her shoulder with a thoughtful expression. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, Henry's composure remained unbroken. The subtle interactions, the respectful nods, the cryptic remarks, and the way others seemed to recognize him painted a picture of a man who was far more than he appeared. Edward, oblivious to the growing intrigue, continued to pace nearby, muttering complaints about the absurdity of the situation. To him, Henry was still nothing more than an annoyance, someone who deserved neither respect nor attention. But the crowd's curiosity grew, their quiet glances toward Henry filled with questions. Who was this man, really? And why did he seem so unfazed by everything around him? Little did Edward know, the answers to those questions would soon turn his world upside down. The tension in the air lingered long after Henry Wallace had stepped into the sleek black car. The crowd remained, their murmurs and exchanged glances reflecting the mix of astonishment and unease that Edward Hastings' actions had stirred. Standing in the middle of it all, Edward's once confident demeanor had crumbled into something far less dignified. His shoulders slumped, and his face flushed crimson, a stark contrast to the composed arrogance he had worn just moments before. Edward took a faltering step forward, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. I didn't mean, he began, his voice uneven. He cleared his throat and tried again. I didn't know who he was. If I had known, I wouldn't have. Wouldn't have. What a voice from the crowd interrupted, sharp and unyielding. A young man in a hoodie crossed his arms, his expression a mix of anger and disdain. Wouldn't have spat in his face? Or wouldn't have judged him, because he didn't look rich enough for you? Edward winced at the bluntness, but the words struck home. I didn't mean any harm, he insisted, raising his hands defensively. It was a misunderstanding. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, less forgiving now. An older woman shook her head, her tone cold as she said, It wasn't a misunderstanding. We all saw what you did. You looked at him like he was nothing. Edward's attempt at justification faltered under the weight of the crowd's judgment. The disapproval in their eyes bore down on him, leaving him unable to escape the stark reality of his actions. Just then, the car door opened again, and Henry stepped out, his posture steady, his expression calm. The crowd fell silent, their attention snapping back to him. Edward froze, his face a mixture of relief and dread. Mr. Wallace, Edward began, his voice trembling. Henry raised a hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. I've heard enough, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. He turned to face the crowd, addressing them with the quiet authority that had drawn their admiration earlier. This moment isn't about me or him, Henry began, nodding toward Edward. It's about something bigger. It's about how we choose to see one another. The crowd leaned in, their collective attention captured by his words. Henry continued, his voice steady and deliberate. What happened here today isn't unusual. It's something many of us face, being judged by appearances, by assumptions, by the smallest sliver of what others think they know about us. But the truth is, none of us are defined by a single moment, a single choice, or a single circumstance. He turned to Edward, his gaze direct but devoid of malice. You saw me sitting here and decided that I was nothing. And in doing so, you revealed more about yourself than you could ever have imagined. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but Henry held up a hand again. No, he said gently. Listen, this isn't about blaming you. It's about learning. We all have our flaws, our blind spots, our prejudices. But what matters is what we choose to do once we see them. The crowd nodded, their faces reflecting the impact of Henry's words. Even Edward seemed subdued, his gaze dropping to the ground as the weight of the moment settled over him. Henry took a step forward, addressing the crowd as much as Edward. Respect isn't something we should give only to those we think deserve it. It's something we owe to everyone because dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. And the value of a person can't be measured by their clothes, their job, or their wealth. It's measured by their heart, their actions, and their ability to lift others up. A smattering of applause broke out in the crowd, growing louder as Henry's message resonated. People exchanged nods, their initial discomfort replaced by a sense of unity. Edward stood frozen, the sting of humiliation eclipsed now by the dawning realization of how deeply he had erred. He looked up at Henry, his expression raw and unguarded. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. Henry studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. I hope you'll remember this, he said simply. Not for my sake, but for your own and for the people you'll meet from now on. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, the crowd slowly dispersed, their conversations now filled with praise for Henry's composure and wisdom. A young woman turned to her friend and said, he could have lashed out, but he didn't. That's real strength. Another man added, it's not every day you see someone turn something so ugly into something meaningful. Edward remained standing in the same spot, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the lesson he had just learned. For the first time in years, he felt small not because of what others thought of him, but because of how he had seen himself in Henry's reflection. As Henry returned to the car, James held the door open for him with a respectful bow. Before stepping in, Henry glanced back at Edward one last time. Change is hard, he said softly, but it's possible, if you're willing to try. Edward didn't reply, but his nod was enough. The car pulled away, leaving Edward standing alone amidst the fading crowd. The lesson Henry had imparted echoed in his mind, not as a condemnation, but as an invitation to be better. Edward Hastings sat in the driver's seat of his car, the leather steering wheel cool beneath his hands. The engine idled, but he didn't put the vehicle in gear. The park, now nearly empty, stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. His thoughts churned, replaying the events of the day like a relentless loop. He had humiliated Henry Wallace, spat in his face, and then learned that the man he'd ridiculed was not only far from helpless, but a figure of immense strength and generosity. The founder of the Wallace Foundation, a man who spent his days walking the streets not to wallow in his situation but to uplift others. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a leaden cloud. He had always prided himself on being someone who saw the world clearly, who knew people for what they were. But today, his clarity had proven to be nothing more than a veneer for ignorance. Edward leaned back in his seat, his hands falling limply to his lap. How did I let myself become this person, he muttered aloud. His mind reached back, searching for the roots of his behavior. Growing up in privilege, he had been taught to measure people by their achievements, their wealth, their appearances. Success, he had been told, was a direct reflection of effort and worth. But now he saw the lie in that logic. Henry Wallace, with his worn clothes and humble demeanor, had more dignity in one moment than Edward had shown in years. A notification buzzed on Edward's phone. And without thinking, he opened the article a friend had sent him. Henry Wallace, the man behind the foundation changing lives. The piece detailed Henry's rise from a struggling businessman to a philanthropist who had dedicated his life to serving others. Edward's throat tightened as he read about the accident that had claimed Henry's family decades ago, the financial struggles that had followed, and his eventual decision to rebuild not for himself, but for those who needed help. He turned his pain into purpose. The article read. Edward put the phone down, the depth of his mistake now painfully clear. He had judged a man whose strength he could only aspire to match. Meanwhile, Henry sat quietly in his modest office, a room tucked away in the community center run by the Wallace Foundation. The hum of activity from the building drifted in, children laughing, staff exchanging warm greetings, the occasional clatter of a door opening and closing. Henry gazed at the framed photo on his desk. It was of his wife and daughter, both smiling brightly. You'd be proud of how far we've come, he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of years. The day's events lingered in his mind. Edward Hastings' words had been harsh, but they were not unfamiliar. He had faced prejudice before, from people who assumed his worth was tied to his current circumstances. But he had long since learned that true strength wasn't about proving people wrong, it was about staying true to one's values, regardless of others' opinions. Henry leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk. His journey had been anything but easy. The loss of his family, the years of rebuilding his life from nothing, the countless times he had questioned his purpose, all of it had shaped him. It's not about the fall, he often told those who came to the foundation for help. It's about how you choose to rise. The next morning, Edward arrived at the Wallace Foundation unannounced. His polished shoes clicked against the tiled floor as he walked hesitantly through the lobby, clutching a handwritten note. He stopped at the front desk, his throat dry. "I'm here to see Mr. Wallace," he said. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, nodded and picked up the phone. "One moment, sir." A few minutes later, Henry appeared, his calm presence filling the room. He approached Edward, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Mr. Hastings," Henry said, extending a hand. Edward hesitated before shaking it. "I wanted to apologize," he said haltingly, "for how I treated you. For everything I said. I was wrong." Henry studied him for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging it is a start," he said simply. Edward swallowed hard. "I also wanted to say thank you for what you do. For who you are. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope to learn from this." Henry's gaze softened. "Change is a process, Mr. Hastings. It's not about being perfect, it's about being better today than you were yesterday." As Edward left the building, he noticed the Foundation's mission statement displayed prominently on the wall: building strength through compassion. One life at a time. The words resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. Back in his office, Henry watched the activity of the Foundation unfold. Each person who entered the building carried their own story, their own struggles, and their own potential for growth. He knew the power of transformation, he had lived it. Henry turned to his assistant. "Let's set up a community workshop next week," he said. "We need to keep teaching people that dignity and respect are the foundation of everything." The assistant nodded. "Of course, Mr. Wallace." For Edward, the days ahead were filled with self-reflection. He began volunteering at shelters, learning the stories of people he had once dismissed. Slowly, he started to see the world through a different lens, one shaped by empathy rather than judgment. For Henry, the moment with Edward became another chapter in his mission to inspire change, not through anger or resentment, but through grace. His resilience continued to shine, a beacon for those who needed it most. In the end, both men had been transformed by the encounter, one through the weight of his mistake, the other through the strength of his forgiveness. The morning sun broke through the gray clouds, casting a soft light over the bustling city streets. Edward Hastings adjusted the strap of the volunteer apron he now wore, its simple logo a symbol of the Wallace Foundation embroidered across the front. He stood outside a community kitchen, nervously clutching a clipboard as families, individuals, and volunteers gathered around. This was Edward's third week volunteering. After the encounter with Henry Wallace, something in him had shifted, and he couldn't go back to his old life without making changes. Initially, the decision to help at the foundation felt like penance, but over time it became something more. Each conversation, every shared moment, began to peel back the layers of prejudice he hadn't realized he carried. "Mr. Hastings, we're ready for you," a volunteer said, interrupting his thoughts. Edward nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping forward. Edward addressed the group with a humility that felt foreign but genuine. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "I'm here because someone showed me what it means to truly see people, not just their circumstances, but their humanity." He went on to explain how he had judged unfairly and acted in ways that reflected his worst self. Without naming Henry explicitly, he acknowledged the harm he had caused and vowed to do better. "We all have a responsibility to lift each other up," he concluded. "And I'm here to learn how I can contribute to that." After his speech, Edward worked alongside the other volunteers, serving meals, chatting with those who came in, and listening to stories that made him reevaluate everything he thought he knew about struggle and resilience. Meanwhile, at the Wallace Foundation's headquarters, Henry Wallace sat in a circle with a group of staff and community members. They were discussing ways to expand the Foundation's reach, particularly in addressing the societal biases that often marginalize the very people they aim to help. "Every time someone makes an assumption about another person, they create a barrier," Henry said, his tone calm but resolute. "Our job is to break those barriers down, one story at a time." The incident with Edward had stayed with Henry, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of why he did the work he did. By remaining composed in the face of prejudice, he had turned a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for education and growth, not just for Edward, but for everyone who had witnessed it. "Mr. Wallace," one of the staff members said, We've been receiving letters and emails from people who heard about what happened. They say it's inspired them to see things differently. Henry smiled faintly. Then it was worth it, he replied. As the day wound down, Henry found himself walking through the park where the confrontation with Edward had taken place. The bench he often sat on was empty, the area quiet except for the distant laughter of children playing. He paused, taking a moment to reflect on how far he had come, not just from that day, but from the countless trials that had shaped him. He didn't dwell on Edward's actions with bitterness. Instead, he saw them as part of a larger story, one where even moments of darkness could lead to light. Across the city, Edward sat at his desk, drafting a public statement about his experience. He hesitated over the keyboard, searching for the right words. Finally, he typed, "I was wrong. I acted without thought, without empathy, and without understanding. And in doing so, I revealed my own ignorance. I am committed to learning, growing, and helping others do the same." The statement was published the next morning, accompanied by an anonymous donation to the Wallace Foundation. The story of Henry and Edward became more than just a memory for those who had witnessed it. It was retold in community meetings, in classrooms, and around dinner tables, inspiring conversations about prejudice, respect, and the power of change. For Henry, the incident was a reminder of his mission to show that resilience and grace could overcome even the harshest judgments. For Edward, it marked the beginning of a journey toward redemption and a deeper understanding of his place in the world. And for everyone else, it stood as a testament to the idea that no one is beyond growth and no moment is too small to spark change. What began as an act of cruelty ended in a lesson of humility and hope. As the wealthy man seeks redemption and the homeless man inspires change, their story reminds us all true worth isn't in what we have, but in how we treat others. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder about kindness. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories.